Has the U.S. effectively given the green light to a 21st century Cold War? It's a very valid question after considering a new resolution that was overwhelmingly passed by the House with a vote of 411 to 10. House Resolution 758 is a piece of legislation with the title strongly condemning the actions of the Russian Federation under President Vladimir Putin, which has carried out a policy of aggression against neighboring countries aimed at political and economic domination. That is the title of this resolution. And it makes a number of demands, including calling on Russia to stop supporting local militias in eastern Ukraine and the cancellation of Crimea's decision to join Russia. It also says military intervention by the Russian Federation poses a threat to international peace and security, which some critics have said could be used as justification to one day go to war with the country. One of those critics is former Congressman Ron Paul. Earlier, I spoke with him about this resolution, and I first asked him whether he was surprised that it passed with so much support.
Well, no, I'm not surprised they voted for it because I understand how legislation is passed in Washington. It's not with deliberate study. This probably popped up an hour or two before. Probably nobody read it. I went through the whole thing. There's 16 pages of it. And if they read it and still voted for it, there's something wrong with them. There's something wrong with them for not reading it, but I think the 10 people who voted against it obviously read it. But these are generally, just superficial in nature when it comes to discussion. But they're very, very important. And that's why I've been so upset about it, because the title of these things and the superficial explanation is, well, we ought to discipline Russia because they're causing so much trouble, and that seems to be the popular thing, and the members of Congress rarely read these, and then they go along with it, but they get themselves into trouble because I remember very clearly in 1998, a short time after I just went back to Congress, a resolution similar to this came up dealing with Iraq, and I took to the floor and took the time in opposition and said, this is a horrible resolution. Although it's not a declaration of war, it means that we are going to precipitate one in no time. And, 4 years later, we were at war with Iraq. Now, let's hope and pray I'm absolutely wrong on this, and that's why I'd like to alert as many people as possible. But it's this kind of stuff that stirs up trouble, and I'd rather dissipate the problems and have our government, tone the rhetoric down a little bit. And this was terrible. This is just a very provocative resolution.
Certainly a lot of controversial rhetoric in this piece of legislation. Many times we see votes take place in the House that are clearly partisan, but what was so interesting about this is, the partisan game was put aside, and we saw Democrats and Republicans really supporting this bill. I mean, for those people perhaps that did read it, what do you think is behind them supporting it? Are lawmakers, do you think, representing what their constituents actually believe, or is this about something else?
Well, this sort of fits my theory that there's too much bipartisanship there. The opposition really doesn't think things through. They also just had they're getting ready to have a vote on NSA. Well, we want to rein in NSA, and a House vote in the House showed that the large majority were against, where they were for reining in the NSA. And yet, quietly, when the omnibus comes up, they just slip it out after the people express themselves. So this is the way it works. But this is bipartisanship. Republicans and Democrats have the same foreign policy. They try to make it different because they might have one a little more aggressive than the other. But when it is compared to a constitutional foreign policy of non-intervention, there's a dramatic difference. So when they talk about the new Secretary of Defense coming in, I said it doesn't really matter a whole lot. They all support intervention. And this is why Republicans and Democrats go along with it, and they get their ear out there and they think, oh, this looks popular. Everybody's voting for it. It sounds good. So they don't read the 16 pages, and they say, well, this isn't really a declaration of war. It might not even come up in the Senate. But you do this enough times, it's propaganda is what it is. It's part of the war propaganda machines, just like the major networks are. You're not going to hear criticism on Fox or MSNBC or CNN about this. They're just going to ignore it.
We certainly haven't seen it covered in the least, which is so interesting, and it was actually difficult to find any information on this bill getting passed, even in the internet, on online media. But in a statement you released, you talk about why you think this is a dangerous piece of legislation, and you mentioned that it's a war declaration, that it talks about how Russia poses a threat to America's international peace and security. Some people will look at that and just read it as empty rhetoric, but you say it could be used as justification for war going forward. Talk about that.
Well, it's propaganda, and the more people who hear that in the Congress, the more likely they'll go along with it. But if you look at what's been in the news for the last year, ever since NATO and the European Union committed that coup and overthrew an elected leader in Ukraine, it's been steady. So, and this is just a continuation of that and another step, and depends on what happens here. It may be that the sanctions and everything will backfire. Interestingly enough, the one part of that bill that I just had to laugh at, it was so silly. They said one of the problems we have to rein in the Russians for is putting on sanctions that are hurting the Ukrainians. And I thought, who's putting on sanctions on whom? This is so ridiculous. But the good news, I think, is in spite of the fact we're not seeing it on the news and you had trouble finding it, there are some other people speaking out. There are a couple articles today, and Salon will write about it, and even we have a guy that thinks has been way out of it on foreign policy. Henry Kissinger actually is coming up with decent statements that said we got it wrong on this, and maybe he feels safer because he's not in government, but he's making more sense now than he's ever made before.
Well, what's next for this resolution? I mean, does it need to be passed in the Senate, signed into law before it can carry any weight, or does it just stand as it is?
Yeah, this won't go anywhere. I mean, Reid would, if they were serious about, setting the stage and implementing some of this, and it's a long-term project, Reid won't bring it up in the Senate. If they did, some weird reason, pass it in the Senate, it wouldn't be signed the president. He would totally ignore it. So it's really a stunt, but it's a dangerous stunt because it conveys opinion. And now they can brag and say, this is what we said about the Russians, and only 10 people opposed it. And there were 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. I believe in coalitions. I don't believe in this bipartisanship supporting bad stuff. But the coalitions of coming together, say with those Democrats and Republicans, that's what we need. Those are the kind of people I worked with in Washington, like a Dennis Kucinich and I. Matter of fact, we've been talking about this these last couple days on what we can do to get more attention, to let the American people know what's going on and what the long-term ramifications of this would be. And I think that, long-term is probably going to end all this is what ended the Soviet system. The Soviets and the Americans didn't have to fight a nuclear war. The Soviets went broke. They couldn't afford all this. And that is what will happen to America, and we'll all suffer for it. So even though people think, well, the answer to this is just threatening Russia and putting on sanctions, those sanctions just may backfire on the Europeans as well as the Americans, because there are going to be some changes in America just as they are in Russia. Yes, we're penalizing the people of Russia, but eventually you're going to see a downturn here in our oil industry because it's affecting our economy as well.
All right. Former Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul, thank you so much for weighing in on that.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.